I actually think the majority of the debate should be with regards to mitigation and impact.
I 100% agree with that.
And to get to that point, you have to have an agreement that the science is correct,
right,
that the predictions are pretty good and the models are pretty good.
And in fact, that's why people argue about the science, because they don't want to have that debate. Once everyone agrees on the science, then you move to policy debate. And I think the fossil fuel interests kind of know they're going to lose that debate. And so they want to keep the debate focused. This is a strategy to keep it focused on science.
Okay.
It's not, there's nothing legitimate in their science. There's no legitimate objections to climate science. Let me just be clear about that. There are things we don't know, but we acknowledge we don't know those. There are things that we know very carefully, with high degree of certainty. And there's really no question. We know the Earth's warming. We know humans are the dominant driver of climate. We know future warming will be a few degrees Celsius. Those are things that are not debatable at this point.
Okay, that's fair. So do you think the challenges to the science directly come from within the oil and gas industry?
Well, I don't know if it's just the oil and gas industry, but it's people opposed to policy. So it could be people that are opposed to government action. There are people out there who say, government should do nothing in the world. I mean, I think Bitcoin has a lot of kind of people like that in that world. So I'm sure you've run into them. There's no role for the state to do anything with regard to, anything. And so
the libertarian free market.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think that those people also play a role in this, as in addition to the people who are politically who are financially motivated. And let me just say that probably the thing that worries me the most is that the energy debate is going to enter the broader culture war, like COVID vaccines, for example. And it won't.
I think it's already there.
Yeah, I mean, this is really what worries me. So it's not even going to be about people who are motivated by a particular financial incentive. It's going to be how you show your loyal to your tribe. If I'm going to talk about how terrible windmills are, that I'm going to do that, and that's going to show all my friends that I'm a loyal member of the tribe of people who despise. We despise intellectuals. We don't believe in climate change. It becomes this shorthand notation for it. And I think that's one of the ways that we could fail to solve climate change.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point, because it's something we've covered on the show quite a bit. It's something I'm particularly interested in as somebody who travels between the US and the UK a lot. And I would say in the UK, I'm considered a conservative, and my conservative friends in the US think I'm a lefty. But I've had a good lens for seeing, not only in the media and on social media, but in my interactions. I spend a lot of time in different parts of the US. In our last few trips, we've been to New York and California, but we've also been to Austin and Dallas. We've been here in Nashville. We've been to Miami. Where else have we been? DC. And so I do travel to both Republican and Democrat areas. I do follow the news. I do follow the influence online. And there is, feels like to me, there is now this hard line. On one side of the line, to the left of it, is, I'm generalizing here, but broader concerns about climate and wanting to move to renewables, pro-choice, anti-gun, higher concerns with regards to COVID and vaccines. I'm very careful on the COVID one. On the other side, it is pro-Second Amendment, pro-First Amendment, pro-life, anti-restrictions with regards to COVID and lockdowns, more skepticism with regards to vaccines. That's just kind of like a general picture. You might agree, disagree. When I'm in the UK, with regards to, say, COVID and vaccines, I don't find a real split between those who vote Conservative and Labour. It just doesn't really exist. We don't have a Second Amendment debate because we don't have guns. Even with regards to climate change, Danny, correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but I don't tend to find there's much of a split.
No.
You will get ultra-conservative people
Right.
who maybe fit in that, from the UK, fit in that Republican lens, the contrarian.
Like the UKIP?
Like, yeah, well, it's kind of those kind of people, but they're a very small, tiny group. They're not pretty much half of the voting population.
Right.
I think climate skepticism in general is much more in the UK.
Yeah, there's a much general acceptance that this is an issue and we need to deal with it. And I think that would be across Europe. The problem we have here is the US tends to lead the way on policy decision and the world follows, or we look to the US. on certain things. And putting this into the culture war is a huge problem. And I think the media and journalists and influencers have a responsibility of finding the actual truth. And look, I accept we all have a bias.
Except I would say some of the media, this is their goal, is to, you go to Fox News, their goal is not to find the truth. Their goal is to actually, whip up this resentment.
I think CNN and Fox are like, as a neutral person, I can see them both playing the same game. I can see it.
All right. As a climate guy, I'm more attuned to what Fox says than CNN, but I take that. I accept your point.
Yeah, and I think what that is because like on your particular issue of climate change, CNN probably agrees more with you, and whereas the Tucker Carlson side of the crowd tends to disagree a bit more. And so, like, I can see why you see that in your particular issue. I'm talking generally.
Right.
It doesn't feel like the US has very good neutral sources of news, which is why I looked at someone like yourself as an expert. So my audience, I don't know the percent that people would be Republican, Democrat. The public conversations, or those who tend to comment on YouTube, tend to be more, I would say, towards the right. And therefore, when I was challenging Alex Epstein, I got some very negative comments.
Right. Yes.
I do get a lot of positive private comments as well.
Yeah, don't read the comments.
Don't read the comments.
That's my my rule number one.
That's Rogan's advice and Danny's advice to me. With regards to this, there will be, I think, a higher level of criticism from my audience towards you, but I will definitely get a bunch of emails appreciating the fact you have on. This is a long lead up to a point I wanted to make, or a question I wanted to ask. You had the debate with Alex, and it was fascinating. It was fascinating, but I don't think it was well structured. I think it needed to be 4 hours long, and you both needed more time. That aside, you were willing to do the debate. If I had have asked Catherine, she would have said, no, I'm not even talking to these people. They're a waste of time. We should not engage with them. So why is it you chose to engage and others didn't? And do you think people should, like climate scientists, should be engaged in debates with people like Alex?
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand that there are really two issues here. One is the science issue, is climate change actually happening? And then the other one is the policy issue of what you do about it. And I absolutely agree with all of my colleagues who won't debate the science. Like, if the Steamboat Institute had approached me and said, climate change, is it real? Is it caused by man-made? I would not have done that.
Okay.
I mean, that's not something I want to do. But questions about should we do this? Those are questions that aren't decided by science. So science obviously is an input to them. You look at the science, but you also look at your values and you look at your policy options. You look at how risk averse you are. You look at, you look at all these things that are not science. And the only way to resolve policy debates is with public debate. And so, I'm happy to go out and debate policy because I'm in addition to being a scientist, I'm also a citizen.
Mm-hmm.
And as a citizen, I have the right to go out and advocate for policies that I like. And so this is, and I get a much bigger platform. Most people can't do that. Most people have all of these ideas, and no one will invite them to debate someone on a stage in front of, 150 people, but they will invite me. And so I'm going to do that. I'm going to go out and say, these are the policies I think we should do. And so I don't want to criticize my colleagues at all. I think every scientist has to make a decision about how they want to spend their time. And I think that people like Michael Mann and Catherine Hayhoe, what they do is so valuable and so fantastically good that they should keep doing what they're doing. I don't mind going to very hostile audiences. And because like if you saw the Steamboat, after Alex would talk, people would cheer him. And then after I talk, you couldn't hear a pin drop. And, I kind of get a charge out of that in some respects of telling stuff that people, I can just tell they don't want to hear. And my goal is not to convince them. My goal is just to plant a seed, give them the information so they can convince themselves. That the seed of information, then maybe next week they see a story in Forbes, and a week later they hear something from, on the news. And then after a while, it kind of grows into this different worldview. Because, ultimately, on sort of, I do feel that we are going to switch to renewable energy reasonably quickly. I do think that ultimately everyone will understand that what the scientists are saying about climate is right. I'm just trying to get people there as quickly as possible.
And so this has to be solved in your eyes through policy. Again, you won't be fully aware of this, but a lot of people in the Bitcoin space lean towards libertarian or anarchist. They're very anti-government intervention, government regulation. I'm, as a British person, I'm very openly honest that I am a pro-democracy person. I'm reluctant. I say a reluctant statist because I don't think we have particularly great government at the moment. I think the impact of inflation comes from the government's mismanagement of monetary policy. But at the same time, I am not somebody who wants to see a complete collapse of the state. That's not the world I live in. A lot of listeners do. If your belief, therefore, is if this was left to the free market, nothing would be done.
Yeah, I have a couple of responses to that. So the first one is, let's talk about electricity. A truly libertarian electricity policy is everyone has solar panels in their house and a battery, and they just generate their own power. I mean, that's the libertarian electrical system. Once you have a grid...
I disagree with that.
No, once you have a grid, you have to have the government. Okay. I mean, you have to have rules. I mean, you have to have a manager of the grid, make sure there's enough power available. That's what ERCOT does.
Why can't you have a private grid?
Well, I mean, who's going to set the rules? You're going to let a company set the rules?
Well, I mean, that's what they would say. Yes. Yeah.
But I mean, then the company's going to set the price of electricity just the way the drug companies in the U.S. set the price of drugs. 25% of people won't be able to afford it. 75% of people will be paying 3 times what we're paying now. It's going to hurt the economy. I mean,
I think I know where you're going, because
you could do that. Just like you could require everyone to generate their own electricity.
Is it because a grid by virtue of being a grid has to be a monopoly?
Yeah, I mean,
so there's no competition.
A grid is this unified structure. It's like a giant plant. And grid operators need to make sure there's enough power at every moment of the day. They have to balance the power supply and the power demand. And that's essentially the job of the grid operator. And that's what ERCOT does in Texas.
Okay.
They make sure there's enough generators producing power every day. So they're looking at the weather the day ahead. They say, we need this many gigawatts at 4 p.m., and then they make sure there are enough generators. They do that through this auction system. I won't go into that. But you need to have a centralized organization. And once it becomes for profit, I think the system is going to fall apart. I mean, it will be a different world than the one we have now. A world where not everyone can afford power. And then you get to this idea of human flourishing. I mean,
So I'm just going to go back on that step. It's like if I go down to the shops there and there's 2 coffee shops, in a free market, they get to compete for my business based on the price they charge for the coffee and the quality and the service. And I make a rational choice based on those. So one might be better quality, but more expensive, and I'd rather go for the cheaper. And I get those choices. Right. But with a grid, I can't. Whilst you can have different providers operating on the grid, which we have in the UK, the grid itself, I can't switch grids. I can't this grid compete with that grid.
That's exactly right. You can't build a second grid and then have them compete. Yeah,
that's a really good point.
I suppose that's a different way to imagine. So instead of doing that, we'll build multiple grids, but that would be a big waste.
Yeah, okay, but that makes sense. That's the argument for that. There has to be a centralizing force, and when there's a monopoly, you can end up pricing people out.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And that would inevitably happen. Exactly the same way it happens with drugs in the U.S. They set the price of drugs to maximize their revenue, not to make it affordable to everybody.
Yeah.
And so, to be honest, I had all these ideas I was going to respond. I can't remember. I do remember your last question, though, is do we need the government? And the answer is we absolutely need the government. And the reason you need the government to solve climate change is because the costs of fossil fuels go beyond the costs of digging up, refining, transporting energy. If those were the only costs, you wouldn't need the government, because then renewables could just compete with fossil fuels on price, and whichever one wins, wins. But fossil fuels have these external costs. So economists would call them externalities. Climate change is a classic one. So the price of climate change is not priced into the price of gasoline. So if you go buy a gallon of diesel, or a liter of diesel, I guess, and you drive to the store to get some apples, the carbon dioxide you emit when you do that, that's going to stay in the atmosphere essentially forever on timescales that we care about, not literally forever, but on sort of the timescale of you and your kids. That's going to stay, and it's going to be changing the climate that whole time. And you don't pay for any of those damages. So right now, the climate damages we're experiencing were actually carbon that was emitted, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. We're subsidizing those people. And those people didn't pay for the damages that we're now experiencing. And so you have to internalize, if you want to have a market that works correctly, things have to be priced correctly. That's Econ 101. If things are not priced correctly, the free market doesn't generate the socially optimal result. And so things have to be priced correctly. That means you have to include the price of climate change. You have to include the price of air pollution deaths. Millions of people every year are killed or die. And then there's all these other health impacts of air pollution. It's very well documented. And then you also have to incorporate the issues with national security, the fact that it's a commodity that goes up and down. National security, let me just talk about this. So right now, or very soon, Joe Biden is going to go to Saudi Arabia, hat in hand, begging them to increase their production. I mean, this is not in the United States' best interest. This is terrible. Why should we have to go and beg a really terrible country